Don't follow me.
The 500-meter structure designed to withstand orbital bombardment finally gave way, held up only by a single, exhausted human. Giants who lose their power are deemed disposable, yet one survived the ultimate planetary betrayal because she trusted the weakest creature in the galaxy. He didn't save her with lasers or brute force. He saved her because someone, finally, just decided to stay. Before we find out what happens when fragility trumps force, tell me quickly, where are you listening from? And hit that subscribe button to join our growing collection of cosmic absurdity. Now, let the cleanup begin. Caleb Rowe was a man built exclusively from the cheapest, most durable materials available on the galactic market. Scar tissue, caffeine, and a profound, bone-deep inability to quit a job before the final invoice was paid. At 44, his body looked less like a vessel for life and more like a poorly maintained orbital scrap hauler, dented, welded, and constantly listing to one side. He wasn't courageous. Courage implies having a choice. Caleb was merely persistent, the human equivalent of moss growing on the wet side of a forgotten rock. If you needed someone to perform a task so mundane, so dangerous, and so universally disliked that even the drones refused the assignment, Caleb was your guy. He cleaned up. He mapped the things that should have stayed lost. He stayed where everyone else had fled, which, given his history of abandonment by family, corporations, and every system he'd ever believed in, was less a noble calling and more a deeply ingrained coping mechanism. His greatest fear wasn't death. It was clocking out and realizing the entire universe had vanished and forgotten to tell him. Keller TA was an acronym for Kindly Handle Every Layer Right, Thank a Lot. Which was a lie. Keller TA was actually a biological exclusion zone, a planet of howling winds, volatile magnetic fields, and terrain composed primarily of living silica canyons that shifted shape when you weren't looking. The planet's name, when whispered by the few survey teams who dared approach, often sounded like helter-skelter, a frantic, disorganized scramble, which was precisely what life here felt like. Caleb steered his ground crawler, the reluctant janitor, through a particularly jagged passage, the ambient geomagnetic static making the dash console flicker like a nervous neon sign. He was here because 3 specialized giant sensor arrays, the kind used by the colossal Vorkai species to monitor their planetary power infrastructure, had gone silent in the span of an hour. The official report from the Galactic Infrastructure Conglomerate stated the sensors must have malfunctioned due to localized field instability. Caleb knew better. He knew failure wasn't usually silent. Silence meant controlled, precise, and expensive destruction. "All right, reluctant janitor," Caleb muttered to the empty cabin, the recycled air tasting faintly of burnt coffee and existential dread. "Let's find out how much damage a 6-meter alien can do when they're having a really bad day. And let's hope the hazard pay covers a full spinal replacement this time." He checked his wrist-mounted Geiger counter. No, wait. Geomagnetic flux meter. The needle was dancing nervously in the yellow band. The context of the galaxy dictated that giant species were not rulers. They were utilities. Their immense powers, drawn from manipulating planetary energy fields through internal biological amplification, made them necessary, but also terrifyingly dependent. When a planet's field collapsed, or when a giant lost their internal connection, they became unstable, dangerous, and, most importantly, disposable. The Vorkai giants who lost their power weren't killed out of malice, but out of systemic, efficient fear. Caleb was currently driving directly into the primary waste disposal site for such instability. He passed the perimeter markers, crude, heavy-duty signs that simply read, "Prohibited Zone, Immediate Termination Authorized." Caleb adjusted his seat. "Oh, good, termination. At least that's a clean ending. Usually, they just let you get sued by your replacement." After another kilometer, the landscape changed dramatically. The living silica canyons gave way to a vast, flattened area surrounding the ruins of an abandoned alien mining refuge. This wasn't the slow decay of nature. This was sudden, violent, precise erasure. "Bingo!" Caleb sighed, tapping the console. Controlled destruction. That explains the sensor silence. They weren't broken. They were disintegrated. He parked the reluctant janitor behind a pile of shattered crystalline struts. The air here vibrated with residual chaotic energy. It felt like standing inside a tuning fork that had just been hit by a hammer. Caleb grabbed his basic survey kit, a scanner, a geomapper, and a wrench he kept purely for moral support. As he stepped out, the ground beneath his worn boots felt oddly tacky. The metallic dust tasted of ozone and regret. The first sign of true anomaly wasn't auditory or visual, but gravitational. Something nearby was massively, disproportionately heavy, and the energy field was struggling to contain its presence. Caleb followed the geotrace into the shadow of what used to be a central processing tower, now a heap of fused metal. That's when he saw her. The sight of Thera Corvan was, even through Caleb's lens of exhaustion and professional cynicism, staggering. She was a Vorkai giantess, easily 7 meters tall, crouched amidst the debris. Her posture was not resting, it was coiled, radiating an immense contained power that even without an active planetary field should have shattered the air around her. She possessed the striking, almost terrifying human-like beauty, characteristic of her species, but her body was currently a landscape of stress. Luminous, cobalt markings that usually pulsed with steady geomagnetic strength flickered intermittently, like a faulty circuit board, and were dimming rapidly. She was focused intensely on a point in the distance, the direction of the Valley of Neutral Storms, where the atmospheric energy fields were known to be dangerously unstable. Caleb froze. He was a speck of dust in her shadow. His protocol dictated immediate retreat and calling for heavy recovery equipment. His experience dictated checking the field measurements first, just in case he could get a cleaner reading before she vaporized him. He raised his geoscanner. The moment he did, Thyra's head snapped towards him with impossible speed. Her eyes, huge and piercing, met his. There was a brief surge, a whisper of the power she once commanded, a momentary bodily geomagnetic amplification that could tear the canyon apart. Caleb's scanner sputtered and died, mercifully saving him the humiliation of seeing the numbers before he died. The ground shuddered, not from an uncontrolled collapse, but from a deliberate, minimal display of force intended solely to frighten him away. A small boulder, the size of Caleb's small transport, lifted 2 centimeters and then dropped with a dead, heavy thud. Thera's voice, though pitched low, vibrated the very air in Caleb's chest, a deep resonance that sounded like the earth itself grinding its teeth. "Don't follow me." It wasn't a question nor a plea. It was a command laced with a desperate kind of self-preservation, both for herself and, surprisingly, for the irritatingly fragile thing she had just spotted. The giantess was exiling herself, and she was demanding that the universe, represented by one small, tired human, respect that exile. Caleb, ever the man of efficiency, took 2 steps back and consulted the crumpled mandate in his pocket, reading the fine print regarding encountering high-value, highly volatile biological assets. "Oh," he sighed, looking at the dead scanner. "Look, I appreciate the warning, ma'am, I really do," Caleb called out, his voice thin against the ambient static. "But corporate just wants those sensor readings. If you could just stand still for 30 seconds, I promise I can beat the hell out of your hair before the next quarter hits." Thyra's expression remained fixed, a mask of excruciating internal control. "You cannot measure what is about to happen, human. Go. Now." She turned her massive back to him, focusing her attention back toward the distant, turbulent sky. Caleb knew when he was beat, especially when being beat meant avoiding immediate disintegration. He retreated about 50 meters back towards the relative safety of the reluctant janitor. He wasn't fleeing, he was tactically repositioning. Besides, the giantess had issued a command, and Caleb had a lifetime of ignoring people who told him what to do. He stopped and scanned the sky with a low-tech ocular viewer, avoiding the magnetic interference. That's when he saw the signature, the characteristic swirling, Unstable energy fields of the Valley of Neutral Storms were not neutralizing. They were consolidating. "Oh, you have got to be kidding me," Caleb whispered. This wasn't a minor fluctuation. This was a Class 5 geomagnetic storm, the kind that drew power away from the planetary core, draining the very field that sustained the Vorkai, and, incidentally, protected the planet from sterilizing radiation. It looked exactly like the massive, churning, deep red signature of Jupiter's worst cyclones, scaled up and aimed directly at Keeler TA. The storm wasn't just approaching. It was already beginning to collapse the localized field. Caleb felt the subtle, disorienting pull of gravitational shifts as the planet itself began to twitch. Thera hadn't warned him off out of generalized hostility. She had warned him because she knew the disaster approaching, and she knew she was the epicenter. The sound was less a crash and more a deep, sickening thrum. The air went cold, then hot, then violently still. The geomagnetic storm hit the Valley of Neutral Storms and began its immediate drain on the planetary field. For Caleb, the effect was a sudden burst of static electricity that raised the hair on his arms and made his implants sting. For Thera Korvan, the effect was catastrophic. The colossal figure, who minutes ago seemed capable of manipulating the very rock around them, seized up. The brilliant cobalt markings didn't just dim, they winked out, replaced by raw, painful redness beneath her skin. The bodily geomagnetic amplification vanished, and with it, the physical integrity that allowed her 7-meter frame to move with grace. Thera let out a sound that wasn't a roar of anger, but a gasp of pure, agonizing physical shock, like a diver being pulled too fast from the deep. She stumbled, and the movement was wrong. It was jerky, fragile, heavy. Her massive bulk, no longer supported by manipulated energy fields, was suddenly just weight. She tried to push off the ground, a basic movement for her species, intending to leap across the valley, continuing her desperate self-imposed exile. But without the field's support, the effort was too much. Tendons screamed against the impossible gravity of her own mass. She fell. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive fall. It was a silent, awful slide into the dust. Her hands scraped against the silica ground, kicking up clouds of magnetic particulate. She didn't fall like a titan defeated. She fell like a ceramic statue that suddenly realized it was made of eggshells. Shame, profound and visible, replaced the pain in her eyes. Caleb, still hovering near his crawler, watched the impossible sight. The dangerous, magnificent giantess was reduced, not to an enemy, but to a terrified, immense heap. The galactic context flooded Caleb's mind. Giants without power are killed to prevent risk. They lose control, they suffer, and their pain makes them unpredictably dangerous, so the fear-based protocols dictate their end. Thera had fled her people before her fate was decided. She hadn't been exiled. She had escaped a death sentence and was now experiencing the lethal instability she had run from. He realized two things simultaneously. 1. She was no longer dangerous to dislike him. 2. She was now in far more danger than he was. And 3. The hazard pay was definitely not covering this. The storm intensified, the static becoming a physical force pressing down on the planet. Thera's breath was shallow, hitching. Caleb could see minute tremors running through her limbs. Any movement now, even turning her head, was a risk of musculoskeletal disintegration. The simple act of being was threatening to kill her. Caleb looked at the reluctant janitor. It was running, theoretically ready for immediate escape. He had the opportunity, the professional obligation, and the deep, cynical self-preservation instinct to run, get his report, and never look back. But the history of abandonment was a greater master than self-preservation. Caleb had been left in worse places by better people. He couldn't abide being the one who left first, not even when the person being left behind was a 7-meter alien demigoddess who had just told him to scram. He grabbed a fusion cutter, a heavy-duty winch, and the moral support wrench. He started moving towards the nearest stable structure, the ruins of the old alien mining refuge, a place of razor-sharp edges and unstable beams, but better than the open canyon. "All right, stay put, giant," Caleb muttered, his humor returning, forced and strained, as he assessed the situation. "We are going to need a shelter, and based on the structural integrity of this place, it's going to be less a shelter and more an elaborate way to trap yourself in a future archaeological dig. But hey, it's better than getting melted by gamma rays." He began the absurd process of trying to stabilize wreckage that dwarfed him using tools designed for repairing small cargo lifters. He worked frantically, ignoring the painful whine of the collapsing field, ignoring the fact that he was constructing a protective cage for something that could crush him by twitching. It took 15 minutes of grueling, sweat-drenched labor, welding together fallen structural supports into a roughly triangular 3-meter-tall canopy near Thera's head, creating a meager shield against the storm's initial radiation spike. The structure was pitifully inadequate, a desperate gesture against cosmic forces. Thyra watched him, her huge eyes tracking his tiny, persistent movements. The shame was still there, but now mixed with incomprehension. She was the one who controlled planets, and yet here she was, dependent on the persistence of a creature she hadn't even registered as sentient threat moments ago. Her voice, when she finally spoke, was a whisper of immense pain, the resonant bass now utterly hollowed out. Human, technician. She struggled with the title. "I told you not to follow me. I told you to flee." Caleb paused, wiping silica dust and sweat from his eyes with the back of a scarred hand. He glanced at the collapsing field, then at the giantess, whose agony was palpable. He looked back at his improvised, pathetic shelter, which would fail the moment the storm truly peaked. He put down the cutter. The metal shrieked under the continuing magnetic stress. "Yeah, I heard you," Caleb replied, his tone flat, exhausted, and wholly human. He looked at the giant who had lost everything but her fear. "Someone has to stay." The phrase hung in the turbulent, collapsing atmosphere of Kellar-Ta. Thyra Korvan, the exiled giantess, looked at the fragile human field technician who had refused to leave, and for the first time since her exile began, the shame of her fragility was momentarily eclipsed by an impossible, dangerous flicker of trust. She allowed the human to approach. The real risk was just beginning. Caleb did not possess strength. He possessed tenacity, which was structurally different. Strength fades. Tenacity just ignores the discomfort until the job is done or the body collapses, whichever comes first. In the forbidding canyons of Kellar-Ta, tenacity was the only tool small enough to be useful. The giantess, Thyra, was now a monument of agony. Her fall had been less an impact and more a slow, humiliating crumpling, the shame of weakness almost as incapacitating as the throbbing, systemic pain that radiated from her core, where her vanished geomagnetic powers had once resided. She lay partially sheltered beneath a ridge of living silica, her luminous markings flickering like dying candles. "Right," Caleb muttered, eyeing the colossal, trembling form of Thyra. Her foot alone was the size of his work desk. "New strategy. We need to move you about 3 meters further under the overhang. Slowly." Thyra didn't move, only managed a raspy sound that was perhaps a laugh, or perhaps the beginning of an electrical short. "You are suggesting I navigate, with a body that feels like it's being pulled apart by opposing planetary cores, based on the navigational advice of a creature whose primary defense mechanism is hiding behind office furniture?" "My primary defense mechanism is knowing when to stay put," Caleb corrected, already wrestling with a spool of high-tensile polymeric cable, the kind used to stabilize geological sensors, certainly not intended for anchoring several tons of distressed alien biology. "And right now, staying put is 3 meters to the left." The humor, dark and brittle, was the only thing keeping the air from curdling into pure despair. Caleb attached one end of the cable to the heavy-duty magnetic anchor he usually used to secure his own tiny habitat unit, digging the other end into Thyra's massive wrist. He had to climb onto her forearm just to secure the knot, feeling the seismic tremors of her internal agony beneath his boots. It felt profoundly inappropriate, like rearranging the furniture on a dying planet. "We will do this inch by inch," Caleb instructed, pulling the cable taut. He braced himself against a jutting rock formation. "When I pull, you put the absolute minimum necessary effort into gliding forward. Do not try to stand. Do not push. Just drift." The ensuing movement was less a controlled glide and more the slow, protesting slide of an iceberg being dragged across asphalt. Every millimeter extracted a groan of metallic, grating pain from Thyra. Caleb's back screamed in protest, a familiar complaint that had followed him from every abandoned mining site in the sector. He wasn't strong enough to move her, but he was too persistent to stop. After what felt like an hour of muscle strain and self-loathing, the giantess was positioned slightly deeper beneath the crystalline overhang. "That," Caleb gasped, collapsing onto the dusty ground, "was highly inefficient and definitely contravenes 17 galactic health and safety regulations. If HR saw this, they'd decommission the rest of my spine." Thera looked down at him, her eyes clouded with both pain and a dawning, terrible realization. "You risked breaking yourself for marginally better cover." "It's the only cover we have," Caleb shrugged, catching his breath. "And breaking myself is just Tuesday, honestly. Now tell me everything you know about structural integrity in living silica canyons during a Class 4 geomagnetic collapse." The victory was pathetic. It was not a defeat of the storm or a restoration of power. It was the successful construction of a temporary, ugly, and almost certainly doomed shelter. Caleb's gear was designed for mapping, sampling, and survival. His own survival, which was statistically unlikely anyway. He scavenged everything: thermal sheeting from his environmental tent, 3 mining struts intended to support deep boreholes, and half a dozen discarded sensor panels. The structure he built resembled a doghouse the size of a shipping container, butted up against Thera's shoulder. It didn't cover her. It just created a buffer zone between her immediate proximity and the scouring, chaotic energy signature of the intensifying storm. He lashed the struts to the living rock, anchoring them magnetically, creating a skeletal frame that shimmered under the growing electromagnetic pulses. "It's ugly," Caleb announced, wiping sweat and silica dust from his eyes. "But it should keep the worst of the ionic winds off you. Think of it as a very expensive, very temporary privacy screen for your existential crisis." Thera watched him work with a detached intensity. Her people, the Vorkai, built towering cities of refined metal and geometric strength. They manipulated planetary fields to create defenses that could shrug off orbital bombardment. And here was a human, using duct tape and leftover scrap to defy annihilation. "Why are you so busy?" she asked, her voice weaker now, lacking the sonic resonance of her powered state. Caleb jammed a final strut into place, securing it with a bolt that groaned under the stress. "I told you, someone has to stay. And frankly, cleaning up after giants is my job description, though usually that means picking up drop tools, not preventing a several-ton biological entity from becoming geological dust." He crawled inside the tiny, relatively calm space next to her shoulder. He felt marginally safe, though that was purely a psychological construct. If Thera twitched, the shelter would become a metal pancake. The temporary success was the moment Thera actually relaxed her posture slightly. The shelter reduced the immediate bombardment of energy, lessening the agonizing feedback loop. It bought them minutes, perhaps an hour. "Thank you, little human," she whispered, the gratitude vast and crushing. But the temporary victory revealed the hidden cost, the terrible trap. As the external environment calmed slightly, the internal situation worsened. The reduction in external energy flow did not stabilize Thera. It only allowed the focus to shift. "The ground," Caleb noted, watching the specialized sensor panel he'd set up flash red. "The microtremors are getting worse. The Valley of Neutral Storms isn't just about the atmosphere. It's destabilizing the continental plate. This canyon is becoming a tectonic crumple zone." the shelter was holding against the wind. It was not built to withstand the slow, grinding movement of the bedrock underneath. They had survived the immediate chaos, only to be delivered into the slow, cold jaws of geology. The storm raged outside, a symphony of unnatural electrical screeches and low, grinding roars as the silica canyons began to shift. Inside the narrow pocket of calm, the conversation deepened. Caleb checked Thera's vitals, not that he could do anything about them, he was a technician, not a medic, and realized the pain was localized and growing exponentially. "The field isn't just gone," Thera explained, speaking slowly, measuring the words against the effort required. "It was part of me. Geomagnetic amplification isn't a suit we wear, it's the engine of our bodies. When the planetary field collapses, the energy receptors in my core, they are still trying to draw power from nothing. It's like pulling a limb off while the nerve endings are hypersensitive." "Systemic failure," Caleb summarized grimly. He understood systemic failure. His whole life had been spent navigating the debris field of systems that failed him. "You asked why I was here," Thera continued, her voice gaining a desperate, confessional edge. "My people. The Vorkai are not cruel. They are merely pragmatic. The fear isn't of a giant without power, Caleb. The fear is of a giant whose lack of power becomes an unstable variable." Caleb remembered the briefing data. Giants were exiled not out of hatred, but out of fear. An unstable giant can't control the residual energy. We become living bombs, prone to catastrophic discharge that could collapse entire localized fields, rendering dozens of colonies uninhabitable. "It's a risk assessment," she said, the shame palpable. "I didn't wait for them to decide my fate. I came here to the exclusion zone to become harmlessly inert." "So you exiled yourself," Caleb noted, running a diagnostic on his portable power cell. He didn't offer sympathy. Sympathy was useless. He offered understanding, the kind that only comes from shared abandonment. "My people, the corporations that employed me, they didn't exile me because I was unstable. They exiled me because I was expendable. They send us to clean up the places they never intend to return to map the zones that are statistically lethal. The result is the same. You become a disposable asset." This was subplot C, the deep connection forged not through shared strength, but through the shared existential knowledge of being disposable. Thera's gaze, which had been distant and cosmic, focused on him with sharp intensity. "You stayed. They sent you here to vanish, and you chose to stay, knowing that my instability could kill you instantly." "I learned a long time ago that when everyone else leaves, that's usually the sign that you need to stay," Caleb replied curtly. He checked the ground sensors again. The micro-tremors were spiking. The canyon was preparing its final act. "If I leave, I prove them right. If I stay, at least someone dies with dignity." He paused, then added dryly, "And yes, your instability could fry me, but right now, the geology is doing a much better job. We need to deal with the immediate structural threat before we worry about your internal emotional fireworks." The truth was revealed. Thera was crippled by shame and pain, not malice. Caleb was driven by a grim, stubborn refusal to accept the cosmic narrative of his own abandonment. The alliance was forged in mutual, existential exhaustion. The Valley of Neutral Storms lived up to its name. The energy fields were chaotic, colliding without pattern, creating violent, sudden shifts in gravity and magnetic polarity. The living silica rock around them began to crack, not smoothly, but with jagged, painful fissures that radiated heat. Caleb's tiny, pathetic shelter had done its job for an hour. Now the structural integrity was compromised by the very ground it rested upon. Crack. Thus, a sound like the breaking of a massive bone echoed through the canyon. One of the main mining struts holding the thermal sheeting sheared at the base, vaporized by a spike in ambient energy feedback. The remaining structure twisted violently. "We have to move!" Caleb shouted, scrambling out of the shelter pocket. Thera tried. She tried with every fiber of her being, summoning the memory of geomagnetic strength that could once lift mountains. She managed only a painful twitch. I cannot," she admitted, her voice hollowed out by agony. "The field collapse is too fast. If I force movement, the internal stress will fracture me. I am pinned by my own failing system." The realization hit Caleb like a physical blow. The impossible choice. He was too small to help her move, and she was too broken to move herself. Staying meant they would be crushed by the slowly collapsing canyon roof or buried by a landslide. Fleeing meant survival, albeit alone, the fulfillment of his greatest fear. Caleb looked at the structure. It was failing. The overhang was twisting, ready to shed tons of rock and silica dust onto them both. He could run. He could grab his pack, fire his emergency beacon, and make a dash for the higher, more stable ridge. He would survive. He would be alone, covered in the metaphorical dust of another abandonment, but alive. Instead, Caleb did the most foolish, most human thing imaginable. He returned to the collapsing shelter. The thermal sheeting, weighted down by a falling section of rock, was leaning directly toward Thera's head, threatening to pin her beneath several tons of crushing debris. The only thing slowing its descent was the one remaining groaning strut. Caleb, measuring his meager frame against the massive weight, found a space beneath the lowest point of the tilting structure, near where the last intact strut met the ground. He shoved his shoulder against the straining metal beam, trying to absorb some of the pressure, trying to stabilize the failing architecture. It was utterly, geometrically useless. He was adding maybe 30 kilograms of counterforce against a load of thousands. His bones immediately registered the complaint, a sharp grinding agony that threatened to black out his vision. "Caleb!" Thera cried, terror finally overcoming pain and shame. "Run! You are going to break yourself for nothing." "Oh, I know I'm going to break myself," Caleb gritted out, his voice a tight, strangled sound. He was bracing with his knees, his spine curving impossibly, tasting blood in his mouth. "But if I leave, you die alone. And frankly, after everything I've been through, I am really, spectacularly tired of leaving." He pushed harder, not with strength but with a stubborn, absurd defiance of physics. The metal groaned, screeching a protest that mirrored the grinding pain in his vertebrae. "Someone has to stay," Caleb wheezed, the mantra now stripped bare of all humor, reduced to a desperate, fundamental truth. "And if this is where I stop doing the one thing I was always destined to do: run." He held the impossible weight, a fragile, determined speck of defiance beneath a failing universe. And in the eyes of the terrified giantess, watching the tiny human martyr himself against the weight of a dying canyon, something fundamental shattered within her. Not a bone, but the lifetime belief that power was the sole metric of value. The roar of the geomagnetic tempest was no longer a sound. It was a physical pressure, a vast, invisible fist squeezing the living silica canyons of Kellertay. Inside the pathetic, jury-rigged shelter, Caleb Rowe watched the stress fractures spiderweb across the temporary walls, already groaning under the strain. He hadn't been chosen for anything important his entire life. And now, 44 years old and with a body perpetually aching from labor, he was tasked with physically preventing the planet from crushing a 3-story alien giantess. The irony was so profound, it almost made him laugh, though the noise that escaped was closer to a painful wheeze. Thera, whose luminous markings had faded to a sickly, intermittent flicker, was a portrait of cosmic humiliation. Lying prone, she looked less like a giant of legend and more like a very expensive, incredibly heavy sculpture dropped carelessly by careless movers. "Caleb?" Her voice was a deep rasp, struggling against the storm's howl. "The structural integrity. The cross braces are failing. I calculate stress tolerances at 20% below minimum viability." Caleb, currently attempting to wedge a broken shovel handle underneath a bowing support strut with the sheer force of his desperation, paused. "Yes, Thera, thank you for the detailed engineering report. I did notice the ceiling is attempting to greet the floor." He cursed under his breath, realizing the futility of his efforts. The shelter wasn't failing slowly, it was reaching critical mass. He needed a central support, something immensely strong, positioned precisely where the main ridgepole of the shelter met the floor, the very spot that would receive the brunt of the next energy spike. The only thing remotely strong enough was the repurposed leg of a scrapped mining rover, but the sheer weight it was already bearing meant moving it was impossible. "I can't walk," Tara admitted, her voice hollow, the shame finally audible. "The pain is secondary now. Without the field, my muscles are clay. Moving would kill me. A ripple of energy would tear me apart." Caleb stopped pushing the shovel. He looked at the vast, pale face of the giantess, illuminated by a sporadic blue flash of residual energy. She wasn't just powerless. She was terrified, stripped down to raw, vulnerable mass. "Right," Caleb muttered, his mind working with the brutal efficiency of a man who only ever had inadequate tools. "If you can't move and I can't support this thing from the outside, we only have one option that delays the inevitable." Thara's large, golden eyes tracked his movements as he moved towards the epicenter of the structure. "What are you doing? Human, your fragile framework cannot—" "I know what my fragile framework can do," Caleb interrupted, already bracing himself. "It can file a very complex insurance claim later, assuming any of us survive this." His greatest fear wasn't the violence of the storm, or the shattering of his bones. His greatest fear was being abandoned again. His parents left him with the state. The corporation left him on dead-end assignments. The universe, he suspected, was waiting for the opportune moment to wave goodbye and slam the door. He was not leaving. And if Thyra died, even if he survived, he would be left behind by the only entity in years that had truly depended on him. "Someone has to stay." He repeated the mantra he'd found in the darkest corner of the exclusion zone. It wasn't bravery. It was just an absolute stubborn refusal to let the pattern repeat itself. The shelter didn't wait for Caleb to finalize his decision. A catastrophic spike of electromagnetic energy hit the valley of neutral storms, causing the air itself to throb violently. The remaining central support fractured with a sound like 1,000 breaking ceramic plates. The roof, composed of fused silica and repurposed alien scrap, dropped instantly by nearly a meter. Thyra cried out, not in pain but in sheer terror, the sound raw and unexpected. Caleb was already moving. He didn't have time to think, only to react to the geometry of disaster. He threw himself into the newly created void where the central pillar had been. It wasn't a heroic dive. It was a desperate scramble. The weight hit him. It was not a gentle pressure. It was the entire concentrated, crushing mass of a poorly engineered shelter designed to house a creature whose mass would register as a rounding error on the planet's gravitational scale, all focused onto one point. That point was Caleb Rowe's spine. A blinding white agony erupted across his entire nervous system. He didn't scream. The breath was violently ejected from his lungs. The sound was closer to a wet or pop, followed by a series of grinding noises that he instantly recognized as his own ribs objecting violently to their new non-skeletal arrangement. "Caleb, what in the void are you doing?" Thyra gasped, her voice thick with horror. Caleb's vision swam. He tasted copper. He tried to speak, but the only thing that managed to escape his compressed throat was a high-pitched, unintelligible squeak that sounded suspiciously like a terrified space mouse trying to negotiate a loan extension. Well, this is stupid, he thought, his brain somehow still prioritizing bureaucratic assessment. They're never going to approve this hazard pay. I'm going to spend the rest of eternity fighting with corporate HR about the definition of crushed beyond recognition. He gritted his teeth, locking his elbows and knees. His entire body screamed a detailed, anatomical description of how many things were currently failing. He wasn't supporting the weight. He was merely delaying the inevitable collapse by providing a brief, fleshy interruption point. Thyra watched, wide-eyed, the magnificent Vorkai giantess reduced to a spectator of a suicidal human. She had seen power, volcanoes bent to her will, magnetic fields twisted into shields, She had seen strength that could crack continents, but she had never seen anything like this absolute, ridiculous persistence in the face of annihilation, powered only by soft tissue and sheer bloody-mindedness. Caleb was shaking violently, his face a mask of sweating pain. He managed to force out 3 words, separated by ragged, gasping breaths. "If I leave." He stopped, struggling against a wave of blackness. Thera waited, hanging on the next word. The cleanup crew is going to charge extra," he finished, the attempted humor coming out as a strangled moan. The moment broke something fundamental within Thera Korvan. Not a bone, but the bedrock of her belief system. Her society taught that worth was measured in power, in the ability to bend the cosmos. Giants who lost their strength were disposable, risks to be neutralized. Yet here was a creature who was, by universal definition, utterly powerless, who had chosen to shatter himself to prevent her from dying alone. The trust she had placed in him was based on necessity, on her own desperation. The trust he displayed now was based on nothing but an inexplicable human principle: staying. She didn't have power, but she had focus. Painfully, slowly, Thera reached out a colossal, trembling hand, not to push the shelter, but to find a secondary strut several meters away. She couldn't lift anything, but she could guide. Using the tiny, agonizing remnant of her geomagnetic sensitivity, she managed to infinitesimally adjust the energy fields around one critical point of the shelter, shifting the load away from Caleb's failing frame for one crucial second. It wasn't enough to save him from injury, but it was enough to stop the crushing force from being instantly fatal. The storm continued to rage, but the central collapse was averted. Caleb felt the sudden agonizing shift of pressure. He collapsed onto the now stable enough floor, not unconscious but utterly ruined. The sound of his own breathing, once he recovered it, was harsh and uneven. The storm raged for another half-hour before beginning its slow, tortured retreat, leaving the Valley of Neutral Storms humming with a deep, unsettling silence. When the extraction team finally arrived, a full 2 days later, navigating the treacherous, unstable fields, they found 2 things they were entirely unprepared for: a functioning, though heavily damaged, shelter, and an intact, colossal Vorkai giantess kneeling beside a very small, critically injured human field technician. Caleb Rowe was barely alive. He had survived, but the list of permanently damaged internal components was extensive. His spine was compromised, several ribs were permanently fused in interesting and unorthodox ways, and his left arm, which had taken a secondary impact, would never fully regain its dexterity. He was medically evacuated, given the highest standard of care available to an anonymous low-level field tech, which meant the bare minimum required to stop him suing the corporation, and then, predictably, forgotten. His life did not become a holographic epic. He did not receive medals. He received a disability form and an internal memo blaming him for the unauthorized consumption of alien silica during shelter construction. Thera Korvan's fate was far more complex. The geomagnetic field of KCLRT had suffered irreparable damage during the storm. Her powers and those of her people never fully returned to their former glory. They remained powerful, certainly, but dependent on external, stabilized energy sources, a dependency they had always scorned. Thera returned to the Vorkai not as the exiled disgrace, nor as a restored queen of power. She returned as living, breathing proof of a paradox, a giant who survived the loss of strength because she had been saved by something universally considered worthless. Her people, who measured value solely by power, could not execute her, not when her survival challenged their foundational belief. They had feared fragility. They had exiled the weak. Yet, fragility, in the form of Caleb's absurd, tiny, stubborn body, had saved one of their own. Thera never fully recovered her geomagnetic mastery, remaining limited. But the weight of her shame had been lifted by the actual, physical weight Caleb had borne. She now understood that power was a variable, but the choice to stay was constant. She began to lead not by coercion of the planetary fields, but by the quiet, unsettling conviction that strength wasn't everything. She became the awkward, living monument to human persistence. Caleb, hobbling now, retired early to a small, dusty planetary station far from the exclusion zones. He remained anonymous, never chosen for anything important, still cleaning up messes others left behind. The pain was constant, a chronic reminder of the absurd geometry of that collapsed shelter. But when the corporate drone finally tracked him down, months later, to process his disability claim, the drone mentioned, with palpable corporate annoyance, that the Vorkai giantess had inquired about his specific, ongoing medical costs. Caleb merely grunted, adjusting his newly ergonomic chair. He knew the truth. He had run from his fear of abandonment his entire life, culminating in a suicidal act of persistence. And for the first time, in the eyes of a colossal alien who had every reason to leave him to the storm, someone had stayed for him too. The narrative ends not with a bang of glory, but with the quiet satisfaction of a man who finally found his purpose not in becoming a hero, but in simply refusing to leave his post. The universe was vast, terrifying, and often cruel. But sometimes the smallest organism, when given the choice to flee or stay, chooses the latter, and that choice changes everything. We look across the cosmos, assessing value by scale, by energy output, by the sheer, terrifying geometry of power. We see the giants, the civilizations that bend stars, and we conclude that the small, the fragile, are ultimately disposable. But the story of Thyra and Caleb, forged in the crushing pressure of Kellertia's collapsing field, teaches us a devastatingly simple truth. Real strength is not measured by the weight you can lift, but by the weight you are willing to bear for someone else, even when it ensures your own magnificent and immediate structural failure. The greatest human victory isn't defeating the odds. It's being the idiot who refuses to leave the field when everyone else has already packed up. If systems and entire galaxies are built to abandon the weak, then what does it mean when a creature of pure vulnerability steps in and decides, "Nope, not today"? How much of your own perceived weakness is just the universe giving you an unexpected chance to be utterly, ridiculously essential? And honestly, if you knew that the cost of saving a colossal alien friend was a lifetime of arguing with insurance companies over a prosthetic arm, would you still dive under the collapsing silica roof? Be honest, you'd probably ask for a better dental plan first. If you made it this far, thank you for experiencing the sheer, painful absurdity of Caleb Rowe's persistence. If this story touched that little, stubborn core of humanity in you, please make sure you don't abandon the channel. Hit that like button and subscribe. It's the least you can do for the poor soul who took a planet's worth of pressure to the spine for a friend. Share this video with anyone who needs a reminder that sometimes the only thing that matters is not the power you wield, but the people you protect. And please, in the comments below, write the word "stay" to let me know you persisted until the end, and tell us which distant, forgotten corner of the galaxy you are watching from. Check out the next video on the end card, where we explore why filing galactic hazard pay claims takes 7 lifetimes. Until next time, keep fighting the good fight, and try not to get crushed by your own poor life choices.